Good morning. Happy Tuesday to everybody out there in YouTube land. One Virginia dude here again this morning. This is my second stream for the day. My first one was about Donald Trump's executive order pertaining to the flag. This one's going to be a little more lighthearted. As somebody who is recently over the age of 60, where did the time go? I realized that the past 40 years seems to have just flown by extra quick. Here I am a grandpa and I'm retired. And it just seemed like only yesterday, we were enjoying the 1980s. And I think back back to 40 years ago, I'm very early Gen X. So I've been called a boomer, but I'm not a boomer. I'm very early Gen X. My wife is 5 months older than I am, and technically she is supposed to be a boomer, but she identifies as a Gen X. There is some overlap, just like there's some overlap between late Gen X and early millennials. But nevertheless, I was thinking back to some of the things we used to do when in our youth. We used to hang out in the backyard with a boom box. We drank water out of the garden hose. Um, we had Most people back then, we didn't have central air conditioning in the house. Some people were lucky enough to have a window unit, but most of us didn't have it. Um, and it was even more rare to have air conditioning in your car. I remember having a car with the triangle vent windows. My first two cars had those. It was a Cadillac, an old 64 Cadillac, and then I believe it was a Datsun 510. I think it had those windows, those little ones that pop out, and it really brings air in when you don't have an air conditioner in your car. Back then, air conditioning was optional in Cadillacs, believe it or not. It wasn't standard. So mine didn't have it, but it was so old it wouldn't have worked if it had it anyway. But, I think uh, we went to somebody, we had one kid in the neighborhood who had cable TV when I was in high school, and we watched MTV for the first time back in 1981 when it came on the air. That was like the coolest thing to watch videos, and very few people ever had cable back then. Um, we used to sometimes go to a bonfire. Somebody had a cousin or something who lived a little bit out in the country outside of town. We'd go have a bonfire. We knew where the places were. We could go up in the woods and drink, and the police really wouldn't bother you up there, um, or they didn't know about it. Uh, we went cruising on Friday or Saturday night. We used to go to the what they call the circuit, and it was kind of like a rectangle shape. You go down one end, turn around, and you go back up a different street, kind of like a rectangle shape. And you look for all the fast cars and the hot chicks and everything else. On a warm summer night, that was the thing to do. It was all about horsepower and loud stereos. Um, we used to, when MTV did the premiere of Michael Jackson, the Thriller video, I think that was fall of 83. It was like a 17-minute video. It was like a big premiere. Millions of people tuned in. You had to find somebody who had cable in their house. We the used to have VCRs, and they were like $1,200 in the 70s. And by the mid 80s, you could get a nice VCR for about $200. The price went down, and they had video rental stores. Before you had Blockbuster and Errol's, you had some of the small mom and pop joints. And you could go and rent videos on a Friday night, a Saturday night. And then you had to return them. They had a box. If you returned them to the store after hours, they just had a box. You dropped them in there. Um, you could even actually rent a VCR back then. You could still do that. Oh, we used to have records on LPs, 45s, cassette tapes. I kind of missed eight tracks. I never had an eight track player. I know my dad had one in the car. We had a 66 Ford, and my dad had an 8-track tape player in it, but he got rid of that car when I was about 5 years old. So I don't really remember it that much. And then we didn't have a tape player in the car for a long time. We just had AM, FM stereo. But, then CDs kind of became the rage in the mid 80s. We used to go to the all night drive in movie at Memorial Day weekend and Labor Day weekend during the summer. They would they would have 4 movie features, and you pay, I don't know what it was, maybe $20 for a carload back then. And of course people would sneak in beer and stuff, but they would have all night drive-in movies. It was a Sunday night of Memorial Day weekend and the Sunday night of Labor Day weekend. And it was just like a big party. They had police working extra duty there, but they kind of left people alone as long as you weren't behaving like a jerk and making a bunch of noise. They kind of knew it would be a big huge party, but people kind of stayed in there and spent the night. They didn't go driving out. Um, we used to have keg parties, but when I was in college, behind our fraternity house. You did these things. You went stargazing. Sometimes you drive over by the airport, which you'd never do that now, but you could park outside the airport property near the end of the runway and watch the planes take off. And we didn't realize it. You know, there was one night when we did some of these things. We didn't have air conditioning, so we'd sit out on the porch until 1 or 2 in the morning, just listening to the radio and drinking soda pop and um, hanging out because it was too hot to go to sleep. You couldn't sleep; it was just so hot, even with the fan on. So we just sit out on the porch till all hours of the morning on weekends and just hang out. We didn't have cell phones, we didn't have social media, we didn't have YouTube, no Facebook. Um, you everybody just had a landline, and you would have to call home and let your parents know where you were, but most of the time you just had to come home when the street lights came on. They had street lights that were controlled by an electric eye, and they would come on as it got dark, and you better be home a couple minutes after those lights came on, or you could get grounded. But when we enjoyed all those things in our youth, driving around I remember after I sold my Cadillac. It was a ratty piece of junk. It was a bucket of rust. I paid $100 for it and sold it for 300. The body was bad, but somebody had a convertible and they wanted my engine, so I sold it when I graduated from high school. And then I had a 1970 Datsun. After that, I had a '78 Chevette, which, ugh, 4 on the floor, crank windows, no power steering, no air conditioning, AM radio, which I did put a cassette and FM in it, but it wasn't exactly what you would call a luxury car. But um, you know, we learned how to drive manual transmissions, or we didn't drive because so many people had a 4 on the floor, a 3 on the tree, and um, you would, after school, you would have a paper route, or you worked in a restaurant or something like that, and you use whatever money you could make. um, you'd pay for the gas in your car, and sometimes you might do something nice for your car, fix it up. Some people had some really impressive cars for being in high school, but things cost a lot less back then. I remember going to the grocery store and getting taking the bottles back, those 16-ounce glass bottles that Coca-Cola tasted so much better back then because it was made with real corn, or I'm sorry, real cane sugar instead of high fructose corn syrup. And you could feed a family of 4 for about $50 a week in groceries. My, how times have changed. Um, but all these things that we did, from the bonfire to the cruising to stargazing to going and watching airplanes, watching MTV at somebody's house. These are things that kind of went away with our generation. Playing outside till the lights came on, and there was no cell phones, so you sort of had to You actually had to interact with people. And we didn't realize it, but every one of those things, there was a last night we did it, and we never knew that that would be the last night. But then people graduate from high school. Some of us moved away. We went in the military or we went off to college. Then we were working, and then, then you get married, then you have babies, maybe you have a dog and some pets. You make new friends with your neighbors. You gradually lose touch with your old friends. And that happened to me too. You lose touch with people. Then you have your college buddies, your fraternity people, um, fraternity brothers, then people you knew in the military, and life happens. And then for some of us, we ended up divorced and single again, uh, with being single parents. And then the kids grow up. And in my case, I was divorced for oh, almost 20 years. And I got married again the second time. So if people waited until they were 50 to get married, there'd probably be less divorce. But yeah, and it's funny because now, I get to experience childhood again through the eyes of my grandson. He's going to be a year old in October. He's growing like a weed. He's already standing up, and he'll walk if you hold his hands above him. So he's probably going to be walking very soon. He lifts himself up on chairs and everything else. He'll stand up, and he's already talking. He's pointing at people. If you clap your hands, he'll clap his hands. It's so funny to watch that little brain work. And then my son, he's all grown up with a wife and a job. And next year they're getting a house. They're renting an apartment right now. But, the time just goes so quickly. And when you see people you knew when you were a teenager, and you look back and there are people who were in their 30s, neighbors, coworkers, maybe even some relatives you don't see that often. Then, now, you're in your early 60s, and the people you always thought of as being in their 30s, well, they're in their 80s now. It's, you know, and it blows your mind, the passage of time, and I was, I don't mean to wax nostalgic, but I really felt about it this morning. I was talking with a buddy of mine about stuff we used to do. Now, we didn't know each other growing up, but we've known each other a little over 20 years because we worked together. But it's like we were talking about different things that was unique to our generation, and the millennials and the Gen Z people. Cursive writing, um, having to go somewhere in a car and actually use a paper map because they didn't have GPS back then. um, Having a CB radio to find out where the speed traps were because there was no Waze back then. The app on your phone, there was no Google Maps, and having to read time on a clock with hands. That's something a lot of kids nowadays don't even know how to do that. We had one rotary dial phone on the wall, and whenever you had to call a radio station and they had a contest going, you know, call 867-5309, hot hits, and you're trying to call to be caller number 9. And with that dial, it was just the people with the touchtone phones could always win. It was really hard to do it with dial. A lot of times you had to dial all but the last number. And then at the last minute when they say call it, then you know, roll your finger over there and get that last number in. But yeah, we normally you had a phone on the wall in the kitchen, and you usually had a phone in the master bedroom where your parents were. That was it. And most homes didn't have two phones, but we had those old. They were either a avocado green, a rustic orange, or a harvest yellow. I think they called it harvest gold, harvest yellow. Or you had a plain old black wall phone. That was it. And they came out with the one where the dial was in the handpiece and it lit up at night. You were living large if you had one of those. I think they called it a princess phone. That's what my mom had upstairs. Um, but yeah, it's like you look back, I look back at the childhood home that my mother had. My grandfather built the house in 1948. I think he paid $11,000 for it in Pennsylvania. And they lived in that house for about 30 years. When he retired in 78, they moved farther out of the city. But so his house was in the inner suburbs, and I just looked on Zillow, and that house, it's a 3 bedroom, 1 bathroom, not even a half bath. It's got 1 bathroom and a basement, and the bathroom was on the second floor along the 3 bedrooms. The first floor was just a kitchen, a living room, and a dining area. And then there was a basement downstairs. It was mostly storage. And that house, $300,000. I looked at the house I lived in when I was in kindergarten in 1970 to, was it 19, yeah, summer of 69 to summer of 70. And it was recently on the market for $268,000. And that was built in 1960. It was a little ranch. And we rented it when my dad was in Vietnam for the second time. And I think my mom rented it while he was over there, and the rent was like, I don't know, $100 a month. It's like, gee whiz. But you go through all these times, and then I had my 40th high school reunion in 2023, and I had about 310 in my class, and more than 30 people from my class have already died. That's astounding. I mean, people didn't even make it to 60 years old. So there, little things like that make you appreciate the value of time. And, you look back at when Michael J. Fox went Back to the Future in the movie. The movie took place in 1985, and he went back 30 years to 1955. And, you know, today, somebody my age being 60, I look back at 1985 with the same memories that my grandparents in 1985, my grandparents looked the same way at 1945. So that kind of puts things in perspective. We are right now. Um, we look at 1975 today, 50 years ago, in the same way that people in 1975 are looking at 1925. That's pretty scary. But I do look back in 1985. I was in college. I had joined the Army Reserve. I didn't have a pot to piss in many ways, but I had this eternal sense of optimism that, America was, was, and, if I stay in school and, I don't mess with drugs, I don't get involved in criminal activity, that I'm guaranteed to be successful. And I would not want to be 20 years old today. It's a different world. It's like you've got these kids coming out of college. They've got a lot of debt. A lot of them have a degree that's not really useful for anything. And, you know, they have more information available to them in the form of the internet. They've got Google on their phone. They've got access to a map of the entire world if they want to look up where something is. We actually had to go to the library and get out the encyclopedia and the atlas and all that stuff. The kids today have access to, they can watch movies on their phone, they can download, they can stream, they've got a cell phone. We didn't have any of that stuff. But you look back at somebody just getting by in 1985, and somebody with working a minimum wage job back then, which was $3.35 an hour, had a lot more purchasing power, real purchasing power, than somebody making $7.25, the minimum wage today. Now, nobody even works for minimum wage anymore. Even fast food restaurants around here are paying 17 and 18 to start. But if you're making $17 or $18 an hour today, that doesn't give you a whole lot in the way of a house. What is it? The average house now is $400,000. I mean, in 1980, you could buy a starter house for $40,000. It wouldn't be the greatest place, but you could get a nice little bungalow in a half decent neighborhood for $40,000. If you could afford 50 or $60,000, you could probably get a 3 bedroom, 2 bath house with a carport or even a garage on it, depending on where you lived. Interest rates were higher, but you know, prices were lower. And now, everything is so expensive that if you're able to purchase assets, inflation kind of helps you. It pulls you up. But, you know, nowadays it's such, some of these kids, I say kids, but you've got people who might be 30 years old. They graduated from high school. They have been working full time. Some of them went to college and they're still living with their parents and they're gainfully employed, but they can't afford to move out of their parents' house. And a lot of them feel like the system is rigged against them. And it's hard to discount them, because every generation always says, oh, the generation after us sucks and the generation before us had it easy. That's a tendency for everybody to say that. I walked uphill barefoot in 4 feet of snow. I had to walk uphill both ways to get to and from school. We sound like our grandfather saying that. But some of these kids today, they feel like the system is rigged against them, like it's out of their control. And I kind of get it. They're being taxed for Medicare and Social Security, which neither one of those programs is going to be there for them when they need it. Um, they feel like they've been let down. And unfortunately, that leads a lot of younger people to fall for the false promises of socialism. Um, they feel as though it's going to give them something, but in reality, it's going to be imposed on them. But you can vote your way into it, but you end up having to shoot your way out of it. They don't that nice soft velvet glove of government comes at you and starts massaging your shoulders. But in the other hand is the hard iron fist of the state. And it's like you have to give up something in order to get a promise of something else. And people will fall for that. Um, Witness the power of that Mamdani character running for mayor of New York City. The guy's pretty much he combines two of the deadliest ideologies in the world, communism and radical Islam. I'm not saying Muslim, radical Islam. He combines that with Marxism. And, a lot of people just because the guy's super charismatic, he's good looking, he's articulate. He really doesn't know anything, but he could sell a rusty box of razor blades to a hemophiliac. He has that gift about him. But anyway, I was just thinking back to the last 40 years, and it's often a discussion. Would you go back 40 years? Would you want to be 20 years old? And it's like, well, no, I wouldn't want to be 20 years old today. If I could go back 40 years and be 20 years old, be my 20-year-old self and know what I know now, that wouldn't be too bad. I wish I could eat like I could when I was 20 years old. Jeez, I remember going to getting a large stromboli. It was like the size of a football and it was like $7 and you could get whatever you wanted in it and they would deep fry it. Yeah, they deep fried a stromboli. It was this little greasy joint right outside of campus. And you would eat that thing. And then I used to go jogging and running a lot. And the next day you'd like sweat and grease. I mean, that stuff would make your blood type turn into Crisco. But yeah, I mean, get a DeLorean, grab some Def Leppard tapes and some hair gel. I'd go back to 1985 for a week. I don't think I'd want to stay there forever, but it'd be cool to go back for just a week, knowing what I know now. Make some prudent investments, and then come back now and have the investments paid off. talk about messing up the time-space continuum. But yeah, it's just, the time, it just goes by. And I didn't mean to bore everybody to death, but I just thought about those things that we used to do. Some in the early millennial generation might have experienced some of that, but the Gen Z, which is what my son is, they never even experienced dial-up internet. Uh, they don't really remember super primitive video games like the Atari and Pong and things like that. And they've all grown up having cell phones and broadband internet. So times are definitely different. I'm sure our parents would probably be able to recall things that they did that we didn't get to do. But I do think that our generation was the last to really experience like being latchkey kids and being outside all the time, not glued to a screen. We would just have to go find things to do, and sometimes that meant finding things to do that could get you in trouble. this we we got into some mischief too, but nothing like some of the crazy stuff that kids do now, like stealing cars. And we never did anything like that. We felt we were badass if we took a six-pack of beer and went up in the woods and drank it. We just thought we were the king of the delinquents. But anyway, that's enough of that this morning. I just wanted to wax nostalgic about the past 40 years. We were Cold War kids, and it's we were after we weren't alive when JFK was assassinated, but we were too young when the moon landing happened. But we will always remember the 9/11 terrorist attacks. That was, Where Were You When the World Stopped Turning by Alan Jackson. We will remember that just like our parents remember where they were when JFK was assassinated. Our children don't remember the 9/11 attacks. My son was only 3, so he didn't remember. Um, there's something that's iconic for each generation. But anyway, I'm sorry about that. I didn't drink enough caffeine this morning, but I wish everybody a very good Tuesday. And I'm sorry if I went on a little long, but I'm sure you all have your own stories. If you feel like it, leave a comment. If not, that's okay too. I just hope everybody has a great day.